Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Johan Persson and I will be talking today about Power Platform and how it relates to finance and supply chain. I work as a technical specialist and you can reach me at my email address or at my LinkedIn address if you have questions or thoughts after the webinar. So let's get started. So Power Platform has been playing more and more of a role when it comes to finance and supply chain. The reason for this is because most of the new functionality is situated in Power Platform, and that's the reason why we will be talking a bit about this and what you need to understand. The agenda for today is, first of all, we will have a quick look at DualWrite, which we use to, among other things, connect us to Power Platform. We will have a look at a bit about DualWrite and finance and supply chain. We will look at setup and troubleshooting. We will have a quick look at the future, and then we will discuss lessons learned around setting up finance and supply chain, and finally maybe some Q&A. So let's get started. What is DualWrite? So DualWrite is the way we connect F&O, finance and supply chain, to Dataverse, Power Platform, CE, and field service, and so on. So it's a synchronous service. You can use it to send data between F&O and CRM. It will be sent, as the name implies, when you do a change in the database. So it basically tries to rate the data in two different places. As I said, it's synchronous. Microsoft is working on an asynchronous version. I think that the pattern will still be that we use mostly synchronous integrations between F&O and CRM. But for some situations where we, for instance, are creating quotes, sales orders, and so on, where waiting for the entire sales order to be sent over to the other system might actually be a performance issue. So there we will be in the future available to have the asynchronous pattern set up instead. It's bidirectional by default, so all the data that is changed in F&O will be synced to CE. The data changed in CE will be synced to F&O, of course. There is two different modes of syncing. First, we do an initial sync, which basically means that we take all of the data from one of the systems that we designate master system and sync it over to the other system. Once that is done and we enable the syncs, then what we will get is an initial as a live sync, which then will be running as soon as we do a change on any of the other applications. It will sync over to the other one. We set up mappings for basically every table and every field. There are a lot of mappings that are available out of the box that Microsoft has built for us. We can do some changes to them. We can change them however much we want, but my recommendation is usually that we keep them sort of in a standard state if we don't have good reasons for replacing them or changing them at all. We can also, in the mappings, filter and transform things. So say, for instance, that we only want to sync customers and not prospects and leads. Then we can do a filter on the relationship status. We can also transform data. So say that we have the name of the customer groups in CRM called A, B, and C, and the name of the customer groups in F&O are called 1, 2, and 3. Then we can do a translation between these two different systems, saying that A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. Microsoft have a couple of end-to-end scenarios that we can use. One of the ones that we are setting up a lot is prospect to cash, so we can actually have the entire journey from a prospect to a customer to actually placing a quote, to placing an order, to eventually paying the bills. That end-to-end scenario will then be orchestrated over the two different systems, C and FNO in this case. So why should we use DualWrite? Why shouldn't we build our own integration, or why shouldn't we set up a different way of syncing data between the environments? So first of all, it's the out-of-box solution. It's the one that is provided with CE and FNO, and it's the one that is sort of the recommended one as well. We need Dataverse anyway, so we might as well connect FNO to Dataverse in either case, and since it's connected, we might as well enable DualWrite to Dataverse. Power Platform enablement is required for most of the new services which are being released to finance and supply chain. So we still need to connect to Power Platform, which means that we get new functionality as well. So that's also a driver in this. If we have Power Platform, Dataverse, and maybe even DualWrite or virtual entities that we will come to it later, we can use that for building no-code applications in Power Platform, meaning that all of the users does not necessarily need to be within finance and supply chain. They can actually be working outside of finance and supply chain in a much simpler and more customized solution for their way of working in that case. DualWrite has some resiliency built in. So if we, for instance, have a maintenance window for finance and supply chain where it's restarted or we are deploying to it, then it will actually queue up the changes in CE in that case and send it over to FNO once it's up and running and fully functional again, sort of. There are a lot of things pre-made. I mentioned the prospect to cash flow before. Here we can actually use the pre-made stuff to make business process changes, meaning that we are actually able to have a lot of things that we won't have to configure or set up or make work, but it's actually done for us. And the most important one here, I would say, is that this is Microsoft's method of choice. The reason why I think that DualWrite should always be the default option is because this is the option that Microsoft is supporting. If they eventually change their mind and get us to use something else instead, they will probably have a method to move off of DualWrite into whatever you are working. So enough with the marketing. In order to see the whole picture, you need to actually back up a bit, and we are going to look at why finance and supply chain actually needs Power Platform. So first of all, is Dataverse finance and operations, or is it CRM? When we set up a new environment today, a new finance and supply chain environment, we always get a Power Platform environment. It is not connected by default, but it is there, and it has the same name as the FNO environment. A lot of functionality are, as I mentioned before, actually dependent on Dataverse. All of the microservices like tax calculation service, inventory visibility, and so on, they're all forced to use Dataverse. They are dependent on Dataverse. Data events and business events are also an interesting part of this, because if you're going to use data events, the event-driven engine is actually Dataverse, meaning that you can't get this to work without Dataverse in any case. So you might be wondering why there is a very ugly beige couch on the slide deck. So the reason is that I liken this a bit to if you move in with someone, you get an apartment together, or actually you move into their apartment, and you have that favorite couch that you have been growing up in. You have had it in your in my case my bachelor pad or something, and you are like affectionately tied to that couch. It's way too big, it's way too ugly, so whoever you are moving in with doesn't want it in their apartment, but you are like, yeah, either I move in with the couch, or I don't move in and I keep the couch. This is sort of the same thing. We on the F&O side are moving into CE. We are moving into the Power Platform environment, and we are going to do some redecorating whether you want it or not. So that's why it's important that we all understand what this is. So how do we set this up? First of all, when we create a new environment, as I said, we have the option to connect a Power Platform environment. We can choose if we want a standard Dynamics connection or a DualWrite connection. What basically changes there is that we get a couple of different solutions that are installed by default. And this is done during the environment provisioning. After the environment provisioning, which is the option that I actually recommend at the moment, this will change, and we will look at why in this session. The reason is because if you set it up using environment provisioning, you will get an environment which is not does not have, in some cases, the correct setup with languages and currencies and so on. If you, however, set up your Power Platform environment with CE manually, then you can link it to F&O, and you don't have to have the wrong setup, because the setup for currency and language especially is done by some magic algorithm in the background, depending on your main Azure Entra ID region where it is actually is. So these are the two supported scenarios, and one important part here is once we have connected the environments together, Power Platform to F&O, it is not possible to actually get rid of it. It's no longer possible to disconnect the environment, meaning that you need to know that you are connecting the correct environment. And that's the way we are doing it. So if we do it during provisioning, Power Platform environment is, as I said, always created. It's always linked in Power Platform, and it's linked in LCS. If you activate it, as I said before, you can't unlink it. It will stay there forever. The only way to get rid of it is actually to reinstall the environment and start from scratch. And as I said before, you will probably have an issue with Power Platform environment defaults. But if you do this, what you can do is that you can take a backup from an existing Power Platform environment that has the correct settings, and that will overwrite the settings that are wrong in your environment, and you can still keep it in the correct way. If you link it from LCS, you will have to choose, as I said before, the solutions that you want. Do you want to run DualWrite? One thing that's important, if you're like me, a consultant, you need to have the correct tenant. You need to be in the correct tenant. You need to be in the customer tenant, at least for now, because otherwise you will only get access to your own Power Platform environment. A new environment is created or used, can be used, or you can use an existing one. You need to access a correct Power Platform environment. So when you set it up, in order to link it, you need to install solutions in it. And in order to install solutions in it, you need to have permissions in that environment. Otherwise, you won't be able to link it correctly. And as I said before, just as with the previous option, you can't unlink it. There is, however, a version where you can reset the link. So when you do a refresh, for instance, from production to UAT, you need to reset the DualWrite link. When you do a refresh, I would highly encourage you to do a refresh of both the F&O database and the CRM database. Because if you do only one of them, they will be out of sync, and you will have to do initial sync on all of the mappings for DualWrite in that case. in order to get it working correctly. You need to have access to the correct Power Platform environment, as I said before, even when you do the reset. And you cannot switch environments, so you can't change to another one. That's the thing. It's used, as I said before, when you refresh environments. So when we are setting up the field maps, we need to start often by doing an initial sync. So getting the initial data from one environment to another requires you either to do a migration job or you do an initial sync. According to the support articles from Microsoft, this sort of depends if you have a large bulk of data or if you have a small bulk of data. It depends on if you have data in the environment or not, and so on. Microsoft is talking about something called bootstrapping when it comes to data. This means that you can actually migrate data into both of the environment, both F&O and CE, make sure that the data is correct, and then enable the link, the mapping table in this case. So initial sync, as we talked about, is not made for migrating multiple big sizes of data. Doing master data syncs is perfectly fine. What's also important is that when you do the initial sync, you actually might, if you already have data in CE and you haven't prepped the data correctly, you might get duplicates because you will add a new business unit in CE, which is linked sort of it's corresponding to the legal entity in finance and supply chain. And when you sync, for instance, customers over, they will automatically end up in the new business unit with a company set on it, meaning that it's basically not the same customer anymore. It has the same customer ID, but since it's not in the same legal entity or in the same business unit, it's actually not the same customer from a database perspective. So either you prep the data with the correct company and you sync it, or you basically sync into an empty environment, or you need to handle duplicates. As before, you need to be in the correct tenant, and you need to have permission access, of course, to do this as well. It also needs to be the same environment as LCS. So, solutions. All of the mappings and the base configuration for DualWrite is actually set up in solutions. That's regular Power Platform solutions where you have the mappings. So there is basically one solution for each module in F&O. There's one for human resource, there's one for supply chain, finance. We have one for the core mappings, which is the one that you will need anyway. And then we have one for global address book, which we will return to. There is different solutions for each module, as I said. We need the application core. The solution is continually updated by Microsoft, meaning that you will need to go into Power Platform on a regular basis to make sure that the database, the mapping solution is updated to the latest one, especially if you do updates of CE or F&O, then you might need to actually force an update of the solution. Your custom mappings, if you do changes to the original mappings, those will also be packaged in a solution, meaning that you can quite easily move it between environments from dev to test to UAT to prod. And that brings me to another thing. If you have DualWrite solutions in UAT and prod, where you have a DualWrite connection, you probably also need to put those solutions in dev and test environments for CE, because from an ALM perspective, you will have big problems if you don't have the same solutions in all of the environments. I mentioned before global address book. Global address book is an interesting concept on the F&O side. It's basically a table that contains all of It contains all of the customers, it contains all of the contacts, it contains all of the vendors, it contains all of the employees, it contains all of the internal teams, and it contains basically all of the legal entities. So it basically contains everything that has an address in this case. And that will add a lot of complexity because, as I mentioned here, it's not at all the same. It's not the same data structure at all as we have on the F&O side, or CRM side rather. So we need to do a lot of sort of patching of the data model and sync rules, in this case the sync mappings. There is a specific solution for global address book which means that Microsoft has done most of this work for us, but I would still argue that if you're not dependent on it, you should probably at least argue that you might not need global address book, so on. As one of my colleagues once said, "Dear party table is no party." It's an internal F&O joke, especially among developers. So how do we handle legal entities? Because in F&O, legal entities, as you know, are silos where you put customers and vendors and stuff in. There is, by default, almost no data movement between legal entities. A legal entity owns its own data and it's not shared with any other. There are situations in F&O now where you can share some tables and entities between legal entities, but by default it's sort of a watertight silo in order to get it to work. And on the CE side, it doesn't really work like that because we have business units, but business units is basically just a folder structure almost. So what we do is that each legal entity gets set up as a business unit in F&O, meaning that you need to sort of link them into your existing structure. You can't use the other ones. You need to use the ones that are created by DualWrite in order to get the mappings correct. So if you have existing data in CE, what you need to do is that you need to move it into the correct business unit and into the correct tagging with company in that case. So a bit about the future. Microsoft has for a while now been working on a concept that they call One Dynamics One Platform. So what's the idea here? Well, so traditionally F&O and CE has been two different platforms. F&O comes from AX, which has been a standalone monolith of an application. CE comes from CRM, which was an on-premise application just as AX. When they went up into the cloud, they basically went to the cloud sort of unchanged, not completely, but they were still two different applications. What Microsoft is trying to do here is they are trying to build a suite of applications, not one application, but rather a suite of applications that works better together. So the four main pillars of One Dynamics One Platform are one, admin, which comes to how do we administer environment and how do we deploy code to environments and so on. One, user, which is basically the user experience, having a unified user experience between the two products so that the users that work in both of them, it basically looks the same. They can access the same data, they can access it, it looks the same from a UI perspective. One developer is also a way of invoking a unified developer experience so that building code and customizations for CE is sort of the same as building it for F&O, and deploying it to the different environments is done in a similar way as well. And then we have One Insights, which is the analytics platform that Microsoft is building to basically take data from both FNO and Power Platform and move it into some kind of data lake where we can build reports on it. So the point here, when it comes to the convergence, is that Microsoft is trying to be sort of they are trying to reuse components where it makes sense. If they have a component built in Power Platform, there is no use in building it again. So we keep it in Power Platform and let FNO use it. So basically data events and security and storage and all of this should be sort of a homogeneous application suite to work better together. So the one admin experience basically means that LCS, as we know today, LCS will disappear. Microsoft has already said that their plan is to get it deprecated by 2027. So what this means is that all of the environments, all of the tier 2, 3, 4, 5 and production environments will be moved into and be administered from Power Platform Admin Center. You will no longer build packages, move them to LCS and push them to the environment, but rather finance and supply chain will be an application within Power Platform Admin Center, as well as a sales or Power Automate or marketing or whatever. So it will basically be the same structure. From a technical perspective, we still won't have that big of a difference. It will still be the same kind of environment. The big difference, however, will come when it comes to the developer environments. There will no longer be cloud-hosted environments in Azure or on-prem hosted environments in your data center. Those will eventually be unsupported and go away. All the environments, even the ones that we are using for development, will be placed in Power Platform Admin Center. The good thing here is that we also get an API when it comes to Power Platform, meaning that we can actually automate things in the stack and get deployments and pipelines and so on working in a much better way. I am really looking forward to this. The new user experience is basically that they are trying to unite the UI between the two different environments. But in the meantime, while that is happening, what is also being done is that we can actually link data or user experiences between the two different environments. So the idea here is that we can embed Canvas apps within FNO. We can embed Power model-driven apps within FNO, but we can also embed FNO pages within model-driven apps, aka Power Platform. So being able to get access to data from the quote-unquote other system will become much easier as we are going forward in this case. When it comes to the developer experience, right now every developer needs to have a development environment. It's usually hosted in Azure as a cloud-hosted Azure environment, or it's hosted in your own data center as a VM in a hypervisor of some kind. What's going to happen now is that instead of having a developer environment, we have an environment which is sort of the same as the test and prod environments, where we can deploy code. But all of the code is written on your local machine. You install Visual Studio locally, you build the code locally, you compile it locally, and then you deploy it to an environment. So all environments will be available online. It will be running the same Service Fabric infrastructure as the other environments. That also means that deploying new environments will become easier as time goes by as well in this case. So when it comes to the insights experience, the analytics experience, there are basically two different patterns today. Either we use Synapse Link for Dataverse, which means that we can push data from FNO through Dataverse to our own data lake, which is in Azure. Or we choose the fabric route, and the fabric route means that we move the data through Dataverse still, but into a Microsoft managed data lake where we get access to it from Fabric and are able to fully take advantage of the functionality in Microsoft Fabric. So, lessons learned in this case. Initial sync and continuous sync. Also, that means initial sync is what we do in the beginning when we set it up. Continuous sync is the sync that happens all the time. They are not the same. They don't work the same. They don't do the same thing. They have the same rule set, but that's about it. One of the things that we actually had an issue with was that someone had gone into data management framework and changed the CSV format. They have actually changed the delimiter in the CSV format, which meant that initial sync didn't work because it actually uses DMF in the background, creating export packages, sending them to Dataverse, and Dataverse picks them up and imports them. If those packages aren't packaged or formatted in exactly the correct way, that will mean that Dataverse will fail to import them, meaning that we will actually have an issue in this case. The thing we saw was that we could do initial sync, everything went through, but we actually got empty records on the other side. And once we got in and changed them, they were actually completely synced again. So that means that initial sync works in a different way. You need to be aware of dependencies when you go into and set up the mapping rules for finance supply for DualWrite. All mapping rules cannot be enabled at the same time. You need to do them in a certain order. You need to have, for instance, customer groups available synced before you can add customers. All of the data that is mandatory on F&O side also needs to be there on the CE side, because if you sync a customer from F&O to CE without having, for instance, as I said before, a customer group or a sales tax group or something like that available in the CE environment, then it won't work. So it will basically fail sync, and it will say this customer group does not exist and you can't sync. The same thing is valid when it comes to for instance, placing a sales order or placing a quote. If you don't have the correct customer available in F&O, for instance, then placing a sales order in CE won't work because they have dependencies as well. Two of the ones that we actually ended up having issues with was primary contact and invoice account. Because invoice account is a customer the same way as customer is a customer, meaning that it's actually a customer referring to another customer. So until you have synced the customers, you are not able to sync customers with invoice accounts because those will fail. So what you need to do there is that you need to disable sync of invoice account in the customer mapping, sync all of the customers over, set it to actually sync invoice accounts, and then sync them completely once again to get them to work. When it comes to contacts, it's basically the same thing. If you have a primary contact on a customer, that primary contact needs to be there. In order to sync the primary contact, you need to have the company that the primary contact belongs to. Otherwise it won't sync. So it's a circled reference that you need to figure out. When you do it the same way. You remove the primary contact from the from the mapping, and then you sync them without primary contact, and then you go back, and once the primary contacts are in place and the contacts are once the companies and the contacts are in place, you add primary contact back into customers or companies, and you sync it once again. So that's the way you do it. Customizations on F&O or CRM might make things a lot harder. So if you have changed the structure of a field, you need to also change the structure of the mapping. If you have changed, for instance, the numerical value of the relationship status of an account in CRM, then you actually need to have that reflected in the mapping rules for DualWrite, because otherwise it won't pick up on the fact that prospects has a certain number and customer has another number. It's important to understand that the address structure on CRM and F&O is very, very different. As I said before, dear party table is no table. For instance, so the address structure, the address is part of the account line, the account table, while on the F&O side, addresses are kept in a completely different place and not at all in the database, in the same database table. So when you sync customer, for instance, what you will get over to CE is delivery address and invoice address, and only primary delivery address and primary invoice address. All of the other addresses are not synced by default. So you need to figure out exactly which address you want to sync between F&O and CRM. It might be that you want visiting address, and visiting address is not part of the customer entity at all. So you need to figure out exactly how to do the mappings in order to fulfill your internal process needs in your company. Database refreshers are a bit trickier when with DualWrite. You need to do them with both systems at the same time, and you can't forget to reset the DualWrite setup before you activate it again. If you do refresh with both databases, both F&O and CRM at the same time, then you actually don't need to do a new initial sync. You only need to push it. You only need to activate the mappings again if the backups and restores are done at the same time with both systems. Finally, when you look at the UI that we showed before, where you set up the mappings, it's important to understand that the UI for the mappings is in F&O, but it is not F&O. It's a Power Platform UI, which is basically iframed into F&O so that it looks like it's part of F&O. One of the things that I actually had heard from a CE person was that DualWrite is something that happens on the F&O side. It doesn't affect the CE side. And my comment is that you can't be more wrong than that, because basically all of the setup of DualWrite is done in CE. It only looks like it's done from F&O. All of the changes, all of the impacts on the data structure are also part of the CE database and not of the F&O database. Lifecycle management is really important. Having a lifecycle management around the solutions, updating them when they are needed, and also being able to move the mappings between the two different environments, say UAT and prod in this case, and having them packaged as a solution is really, really important. Another thing that's important when it comes to lifecycle management is to understand that even though these are still two completely different environments, they are still connected together, which means that as long as you do a change in one of the applications, it will eventually permeate over to the other one. Think of it as two silos with a big pipe between them. Everything you do in one of the environments will also be propagated over to the other one. So understanding this is also really, really important. Compatibility. I mean, CE and F&O are fundamentally two completely different environments. We need to make sure that these environments are sort of linked together, although they will never be completely the same. And also, compatibility is really, really important, because when we say we have an F&O system, then we have a lot of development in the F&O system, customizations traditionally, and most of them adhere to best practices. Maybe not all, maybe we have cheated somewhere, so we have done some like shortcuts somewhere. On the CE side, it's basically the same. We have all of the CE development, and a subset of that is the thing that fall into best practices. What will happen when we link these two environments together is that what was once best practice for CE and what was best practice for F&O might not be best practice for both of the systems. That means that the Venn diagram on what's actually compatible with both solutions is really, really important to understand. We need to figure out where things might break if we have done customizations. That also has to do with basically configurations, because say that you have 10 ways of configuring something in F&O. That means that if you are unlucky, 5 of these ways of configuration, or maybe even fewer, 2, are compatible with CE. Meaning that if you in all good faith have set it up in a certain way in F&O, and the customer all of a sudden decides that they need to have DualWrite in place, then it might be that your configuration is no longer compatible with the application that the customer is going to use. So thinking about that and documenting things that have been done are really, really important. So some final thoughts here. First of all, maybe F&O projects should also contain CRM. So what do I mean by that? If we have a customer that are going to start implementing F&O, and they might have CRM, they might have CE already, I would actually, because when we implement, as you know, when we implement on the F&O side, what we mostly do is that we start from scratch, we set up a new blank environment, and then we move not the code over, but we move actually the user stories over. So we basically re-implement some functionality of what was in the original system, and some functionality we are actually leaving out. We are not moving it into the new system at all, because it's not necessary. We don't want it anymore. We want a clean system. Maybe the processes have changed. Maybe we want to change the processes, and we don't need what we had in the previous system. So in that case, maybe we should do what we do on the F&O side. Maybe when we set up a new F&O environment, we should also set up a new blank CRM environment, and moving into that new blank CRM environment while cleaning out code, old solutions, maybe rectifying data and so on, would be a good idea. I'm not saying it's always viable, but in some cases it might be a good idea to actually challenge the fact that we maybe should keep CRM, because the reason also is that eventually we will probably come to a point where we would like to rebuild CRM. And as I said before, if they are linked together, we can't really just set up a new CRM and connect it to F&O, because it's already connected to another environment, especially if it's production. So when you take F&O implementation into consideration, also think about CE. Install CRM in a provisioned Power Platform environment if you can. If you want it in the same one, make sure that you have the correct default settings. Should we use dedicated versus out-of-box entities for DualWrite? So all of Microsoft's pre-built mappings are built for the standard entities. In some cases, the standard entities, maybe with our customization, have added a lot of logic, meaning that they are more bothersome to work with, they are slower, they have more business logic. In some cases, it might actually be valuable to build a mapping towards a custom entity that only contains the data. But that will require a lot of work. So I would guess most will work with the out-of-box mappings from the system. Finally, if we are not thinking about doing everything with DualWrite, there is another option. We have virtual entities. Virtual entities is basically a way to expose F&O data in CRM. It does require an F&O license since you're actually exposing F&O data in CRM. But in some cases, instead of moving the data out of F&O into CRM or CE, we actually expose the data in virtual entities instead, meaning that we get tables with the correct data and the correct structure, which we can both read and write to. And finally, remember the couch. We are moving a lot of things into the CE environment. Make sure that everyone is on board with this, even the CE people, so that they understand what the consequences of enabling a Power Platform connection and DualWrite connection means and how they should handle their ALM going forward. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It just means that everyone needs to be on board, and we might even need to sort of change our organization structures while we do this, because we need to probably work more together as a complete Dynamics team, together with the Power Platform people, the CE people, and the F&O people, instead of working in silos to get it to work. Questions. Since this is a pre-recorded webinar, there won't be an option for a Q&A at the end, meaning that if you want to have if you have questions, please send them to me. Connect to me on LinkedIn and send them to me there, or use my email address and send them to me. I will happily respond to them if you want. And with that, I would say thank you for this webinar. Thank you for listening. Thank you for Dynamics User Group and MS Dynamics World for inviting me and getting a chance to talk to you guys. And hope to see you at another conference soon. Bye bye. Thank you.